Okay, good evening everybody. I think we'll kick off if everybody's happy with that. Thanks very much to everybody for coming along. You're very welcome to the latest in our Irish Cancer Society Decoding Cancer series of talks. My name is Dr. Robert O'Connor. I have the honour and privilege of being the head of research for the Irish Cancer Society. And Decoding Cancer is a series of events that we run every 6 weeks, 8 weeks or so, where we try and communicate better our understanding of cancer and research in a way that I suppose the average person can understand, and we've a patient focus to what we try and do, and obviously we make sure that it's factually based. We try and raise awareness as well of the incredible talents in cancer research here in this country that we have, and often that isn't recognised. The Irish Cancer Society as a charity spends more than €3 million on research projects to improve cancer outcome across all of the different areas of research. And we support the work of well over 100 talented Irish cancer researchers all across the country in various different fields. All of this is made possible through the tireless support of our community, of our supporters all across the country who do amazing things to make sure that the resources are available to undertake that research. Before we launch into the talk, I'd like to thank a few people, in particular our host here in the Royal College of Surgeons, the colleagues who made this possible, particularly in the events and the AV side, and also to thank my colleagues in the Cancer Society and the communications and the research team. Thank you to everybody who's joined us here this evening physically, and also those who are tuning in all across the globe on the internet, and you're all very welcome. So why we're here this evening, today marks World Head and Neck Cancer Day, July 27th. And we are proud to support an initiative that's spread across 53 countries across the globe. It's there to draw the world's attention to the effective care, control and management of head and neck cancer. And we will hear later about the challenging impact of that disease, both from a medical and scientific perspective, but also very much on a personal level as well. Much of that burden of head and neck cancer is preventable, coming as it does from tobacco, alcohol and HPV, which are some of the major risk factors associated with development of these diseases. And HPV in particular will be a focus for the talk in a few moments. So it's against that backdrop that we have a fascinating schedule this evening. I've had the privilege of getting a little privy look earlier, and it really is a very, very compelling talk that our speaker is going to give. And we've got a really personal angle then after that. So our first speaker to set the scene in the background context will be Professor James Paul O'Neill. He is the Professor of Otolaryngology. Okay, you can say that a little bit better, Paul. Head and neck, which is in head and neck surgery at the RCSI in Beaumont Hospital. He will be followed by Miss Emily Hurricane, a noted journalist and author who will talk to us about her own experiences of being diagnosed and treated for HPV positive cancer and how it has impacted her life. Both James Paul and Emily have agreed for their contributions to be broadcast live streaming out on the internet. So thanks for that. We would ask that there be no recording in here. We are taking recording and we will make that recording public. We will then bring our talk to a close, our public streaming of the talk to a close, and then we'll open the floor here to a few questions. We have a few invited guests as well who have agreed to contribute to a forum to discuss the many questions that I'm sure the audience will have. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, who has a truly amazing bio and CV. Professor O'Neill graduated from the Royal College of Surgeons in 2001. Not content with winning one medal, he goes for two. So he's a winner of the RCSI Council Medal and also the Jim Mahon Medal for Medicine. In 2004, he became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. He completed his Doctorate of Medicine and won the Sir Angell James Prize for ENT Research in London on thyroid cancer. In 2006, he studied in the Smurfit Business School at UCD, completing an Executive Master's in Business Administration. In 2010, he was awarded his intercollegiate in Otolaryngology and also completed a Master's in Medical Education in Queen's University Belfast. He then became a Surgical Fellow in Head and Neck Surgery at Memorial Sloan Kettering. In 2014, he was appointed here with his chair in the RCSI, and in 2015, he was appointed chairman of the Examinations International Federation of Head and Neck Oncological Societies. He has published many research papers, book chapters, and 2 leading medical textbooks in this field. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome him to the stand this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to World Head and Neck Cancer Day. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. And I welcome as well the many people on Facebook that are joining us from around the world. So the title tonight is HPV Vaccination, Time for a Reality Check. We're joining with literally 53 countries around the world today. There have been reports on Facebook of all the various events that have been occurring, and these are some of the pictures from last year. And this is only 3 years old now. It's actually Michael Douglas, the actor, who declared this day, who as well had a HPV oropharyngeal cancer, which was treated in New York under the care of Dr. Shah, who's the chairman of the International Federation of Head and Neck Oncologic Societies. So Shah and Michael Douglas announced July 27th as World Head and Neck Cancer Day. This last year we were in the American Embassy. That's the former American ambassador. At the moment President Trump arrived, unfortunately, he was sent back to America. But we had 2 guest speakers here. Ian Nixon from Edinburgh and Dr. Luke Morris from Sloan Kettering. Head and neck cancers refer to anything from the dura, which surrounds your brain, down to the pleura that surrounds your lung. The dominant disease that we see is what's called squamous cell carcinoma. That is the dominant disease of the head and neck. And the causes, as Robert was alluding to, is smoking, drinking is really the main cause. In other words, a chemical carcinogenic driven process. But we also nowadays, we have a viral driven process as well through HPV and also the Epstein-Barr virus. You wouldn't hear much about that virus at this side of the world, but if you travel to, say, Singapore, it's a dominant cancer that you'll see over there. Gender, age, nutritional status, and also social standing all have factors in head and neck cancer. And these are some of the variety of diseases that we see here. This is a salivary gland tumor. This is a floor of mouth tumor, it's a squamous cell carcinoma. This is an oropharyngeal cancer. When I say oropharynx, your throat is your pharynx. And that's broken up into a nasopharynx, an oropharynx, and a hypopharynx. And this is an HPV disease here, and I'll show you more of this later on. But your oropharynx, basically what we're talking about is your tonsils and the very back of your tongue, what's called the base of your tongue. This is a thyroid cancer here. This is a skin cancer with a metastatic deposit behind the gentleman's ear, and another skin cancer there, and of course a laryngeal cancer. So there's a large variety of different cancers. And we know that for a head and neck cancer to establish itself, basically the cancer develops a cloaking device. So you think back of your Star Trek days and what Captain Kirk did, that's what a cancer does. It develops a cloak. You've got a rigorous immune system, a violent immune system. But that immune system with cancer, basically it develops a number of traits that allow the cancer cells to evade surveillance and effective immune response. And then as such, tumor formation occurs only after the cancer has discovered a means by which it can evade the immune system. And then there's a whole other things that cancer cells do in terms of getting its own blood supply, developing more autonomy to do what it wants to do. And the definition of cancer, ladies and gentlemen, is invasion. Nothing else invades. Invasion is what cancer does. Our cancer team involve everyone from dental surgeons to maxillofacial surgeons to ENT nurses to anaesthetists, radiation oncologists, nutritionists. There's a huge team, and what we practice, ladies and gentlemen, is evidence-based medicine. That means that we can't do anything to you unless it can be proven in the literature. Okay, and we have very rigorous guidelines from around the world, which is based on evidence, statistics, not social media, statistics. And by doing that, that means that if we adhere to that, then we know that the treatment that we give you in, say, Beaumont Hospital or in St. James's Hospital or any of the top cancer centers, that you're getting the same treatment that you would get if you were in Sloan Kettering in New York or MD Anderson in Texas. That's what we need to aim for, the very best, the very best. Now, in the National Cancer Strategy in 2017, there was an emphasis on prevention and also detection and diagnosis. And in particular today, we're going to talk about vaccination, ladies and gentlemen, and this virus here. And there's a lot of confusion about this virus. There's a lot of mistruths about this virus and about the vaccination, and we need to iron some of these out. And I think it's time for cancer leaders around this country to stand up and to spread the truth about what this vaccination can do and the reality of what this disease can do. So the HPV virus is anywhere between 170, you'll even see quotes of over 200 forms of this virus. A lot of the forms of the virus are harmless, but some aren't. About 40 types are transmitted through sexual contact. That does not necessarily mean sexual intercourse. And it's the most commonly diagnosed virally sexually transmitted disease in the US and in the UK. And conservative figures, 14 million from the United States. And essentially all of us in this room have been exposed to the HPV virus at some stage, but most of you have been able to get rid of that virus, and that might take the body up to 2 years. So here's some examples of, there's the common wart, that's type 1 and 2. There's genital warts, that's type 6 and 11. Now, I'm going to show you a normal picture of a larynx here. Look at that, beautiful organ, okay? What a complex organ. You think of all the dialects in the world. You think of all the beautiful singers in the world. It's incredibly complex. How could you smoke on that? You're mad. Beautiful, beautiful organ. Now let's see what HPV type 6 and 11 can do to it. And this is one of my patients in recent times that I operated on. And what you can see are swollen cords. You can see these papillomas around the cords. And then we perform what's called transoral laser microsurgery. And you can use either a debrider or my preference is a CO2 laser. And we ablate the surface epithelium of the tissue until eventually we try and get rid of the papillomas. What's very interesting too is that because it's not a cancerous process, less is more. We'll take our patients back again every maybe 6 to 8 weeks to do another procedure on their voice box. And then eventually what happens, it's gone. And that's where you've given your immune system the ability to suddenly take over and eradicate the rest of the virus. Cervical cancer. This is a desperate disease. And what an incredible moment we're in. This is tomorrow's world is here. We can get rid of this disease. That's not fantasy. We can get rid of this disease. I will show you evidence where we are getting rid of this disease. And anal cancer as well, predominantly caused by HPV. So what happens when we talk today about HPV? I'm going to talk to you about cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. In other words, this is a neoplastic process or a dysplastic process is where it's a permanent process and it's basically a malfunction of your epithelium. Epithelium is a surface. So the epithelial layers, there becomes an issue there. And you can have different grades of dysplasia that ultimately can result in such disorganization that suddenly, bang, it can start to invade, and that's cancer. And in the cervix, for example, we have 3, the CIN 1, 2, and 3, which are grades of dysplasia before finally cancer. In the larynx, we have as well grades of dysplasia. And I know high-grade dysplasia, I'll tell my patients, if you don't stop smoking, there is a 30% chance you will convert to cancer. So dysplasia is a real deal. It's a pre-cancer. And we know with HPV, you acquire the disease, and then there is this long precancerous process. We know that in the cervix, after acquiring HPV, it's maybe 2 to 5 years before disease process starts. Maybe in the oral cavity or in the oropharynx, that's maybe over 10 years. And then ultimately, we get a cancer. So how about we break that progression? And that's exactly what we can do with vaccination, as I will show you. In 1995, we started getting reports that HPV virus was detected in head and neck cancers. Around about this time around the world, we started seeing a rise in survivals in relation to oropharyngeal tonsil base of tongue. So initially we were dusting ourselves off thinking, hey, we're treating this cancer better. But we weren't. There was a new cancer around. And this is a patient who decided rather than get help, he just would take selfies of his tonsil. It's very useful to show these images, but he basically started off in 2013, did nothing, took a picture then the next year. We're up to October now, up to 2015, and we're finally into the summer months. Now, why did he present? Because he started getting ear pain. Why would you get ear pain? Referred pain through what's called the glossopharyngeal nerve. He is cured. That patient is cured. Now, if that was a standard head and neck squamous cell carcinoma, that patient would be dead. So why would that patient be in a different boat? Because it's a different type of disease. I said to you, this is a viral progression rather than a chemical carcinogenic progression. And with a chemical carcinogenic progression, look at all these, see all these colors? All these colors here are HPV negative oropharyngeal tumors, littered with mutation. Littered with mutations. And what comes with mutations is intelligence. So you give it the tumor a cytotoxic agent, it says no thank you. And it works out ways to evade the treatment. Now look at the HPV positive tumor. Look at the colors here. HPV positive, very few of them. So what happens? You give a cytotoxic agent, and if you like, the tumor behaves itself and dies. So although it's awful to tell someone that they have, for example, an oropharyngeal tumor, if it's P16 positive, which is our surrogate marker for HPV, we're quietly very happy because we know those patients will do far better. And that was produced by this extraordinary paper in 2010 by Kianang. This gentleman died shortly after, of liver cancer, shortly after publishing this paper. But it was Kianang who showed around the world in New England Journal of Medicine that these were separate diseases. And the treatment, therefore, he left it open that possibly we would treat these differently as well. Do we need to give maximum therapy to a HPV positive tumor? Or could we actually give a lesser dose because the tumor is, if you like, playing ball with us? Now, that said, not all tumors do, and there's a lot of research at the moment going on all around the world trying to get more information about these tumors. So let's look around the world and turn at what's HPV cancers. 630,000 people will have a HPV-driven cancer, and the dominant form is going to be cervical cancer. Where dominantly will that be? In the developing world. And the reality for women with advanced cervical cancer in the developing world is dying in pain on their own in a hut where people don't come to visit them because of the smell, because of rotting pelvic organs. That is the reality, and that was spelled out to us very clearly at a meeting in Rome in recent times by a gynecological oncologist. And it's shocking to say that, but that is the truth, okay? These cancers, this is the reality of these cancers. And we can't shirk away from that. Even in this country, look from the National Cancer Strategy. Cervical cancer shows a strong pattern of increasing incidence with increasing deprivation, with age-standardized rates about 120% higher in the most deprived compared with the least deprived fifth of the Irish population. That's shocking. In terms of other types of cancer, so when people think of HPV, you think of cervical cancers, but as we're showing you tonight, there's a whole range of cancers. Other anogenital cancers such as vulval, vaginal, anal, penile, 68,000 cases around the world, 38,000 cases of head and neck. Now in terms of vaccination, if you look at the Gardasil, which covering, say, 16 and 18, 16 and 18, they're the main oncogenic strains of this virus. And in particular, for the head and neck, 16 is the main player. But 16, we can prevent these total number of HPV cancers with protection against 16 and 18, we can prevent 72% of those. Now, there's a new vaccine in town. Everyone goes on about Gardasil. This is the vaccine that I'm interested in, the 9-valent vaccine, which is out there with a similar safety profile, as I'll show you. Up to 89% of these cancers potentially can be prevented. That's extraordinary. What about in Ireland? 420 cancers per year, 2010-2014. I can tell you these figures are highly conservative. 130 deaths a year. 130 deaths per year. 6,500 women having cervical procedures, and 1,843 anogenital warts in 2015 alone. So we're talking about nearly 10,000 people involved with HPV every single year, and growing. This epidemiology is growing. It is there in front of us. We can see there are so many mathematical studies which have been published around showing the progression of this disease. This is a pandemic. Now you might say to yourself, well, if I eat well, if I look after myself, if I exercise, that my natural immunity will be good enough. Your natural immunity is not good enough, okay? For most of us, we can get rid of the virus, and it's estimated up to 2 years. That's a long time. But some people we can't. Let's have a look at some facts, and this is evidence. And you can see in each of these slides, I'm putting down where these statements come from, so that people can go and look these up and actually read them and convince yourself. Natural antibody levels after natural HPV infection when detectable are low. 40 to 50% of women develop no measurable antibody response after HPV natural infection. Not at all. Men clear HPV faster than women, but have lower antibody levels than women post-infection. So the bottom line is, through natural immunity, you are not provided infection against a different strain of HPV, and you are not provided protection against the same strain of HPV from a repeated exposure. And this is a graph which, again, from a study showing you here from Lori Markovich et al., and you can see here this seroprevalence of women compared to men. Men clear this faster than women. And we want to vaccinate prior to HPV exposure. That's the reason why we choose to vaccinate young girls, and why we should choose to vaccinate young boys at an early stage prior to HPV exposure. Now, what's happened in recent years is a war, if you like, between anti-vaccination and vaccination groups. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help the vax crowd, it doesn't help the anti-vax crowd. And I can tell you tonight, we're not throwing mud at anybody, because it's time that both groups talk to each other rather than try to insult each other. Many of the people in the anti-vax groups feel ignored. They feel victimized by mainstream science and media. They feel patronized. And like any responsible parent, they're trying to protect their children. So all the people here that are in this audience, everywhere from healthcare workers to patients to parents, at the very basic level, we love our children. And we can agree on that. That's a platform we can start on. And furthermore, for parents with a child who has an illness or a disability, we had an evening here not so long ago talking about that. And my little girl has a disability, so we have no reason for it. So do I understand what you're going through? I do. The upset, the frustration, the worry, the concern, absolutely. So there's going to be no mud throwing tonight, okay? But I have to take off the parent hat, and we have to talk about evidence-based medicine, because that's the way we all want to be treated. And we have to value evidence and not anecdotes. So let's move on. Andrew Wakefield, in terms of anti-vaccination, this guy did something that's very obvious, and it's very easy to do in a hospital setting. And that's basically, he ordered tests that didn't need to be ordered on children who were very vulnerable. Who did he pick? Children like my daughter Ellie, children who are utterly vulnerable. So he chose to choose investigations on them. And why did that? Because in academic medicine or surgery, everyone wants to be in the Lancet, everyone wants to be in the New England Journal of Medicine, and he got his wish. So he basically was academic fraud and produced a paper which was completely and utterly false. And who do we have to thank? The science community. This fell through our net. It was this fella here, Deere, who's an investigative journalist from the Sunday Times, who read the paper and then continued to press Wakefield on what he did, who he did it on, and eventually exposed him for what he was, a complete fraud. This guy's not a hero. He's a fraud. And you think about the MMR, people, this is the thing about vaccines. We don't think about really measles as being something dangerous. We don't think about polio. We don't think about smallpox. What does measles do? Measles can kill you. Here's Roald Dahl, the famous author, talking about his eldest daughter, Olivia. As the illness took its usual course, I can remember reading to her often in bed and not feeling particularly alarmed about it. Then one morning when she was well on the road to recovery, I was sitting on her bed, showing her how to fashion little animals out of coloured pipe cleaners. And when it came her turn to make one herself, I noticed her fingers and her mind were not working well together, and she couldn't do it. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked her. "I feel all sleepy," she said. In an hour she was unconscious, in 12 she was dead. And she died from measles and encephalitis. It's a complication of measles. But there's been a long shadow from the MMR scare, and it left many caring parents confused. And what did we see then? We saw that in 2004, vaccine levels fell by 80%, and we started seeing the rise with measles. We'll see 35 children this year die around Europe. But we have to realize, ladies and gentlemen, that vaccination is the greatest invention in medical history. Look at polio. Since 1988, there's 99% less polio in this world. Does that mean it's gone? It crops up now and then. Here we have in Syria now. The 17 children are paralyzed in Syria because, of course, vaccine levels dropped. And that means that those children are left to this kind of disability for the rest of their lives. Smallpox. If I was to ask anyone in this room, how do you die from smallpox? I would doubt anyone actually knows. But yet this killed between 300 and 500 million people during the 20th century. So if we're going to think of a vaccine for a cervical cancer, well, which one? Well, I'm going to see what's the link here between a vaccine and the transistor radio. There was a young man who grew up in eastern China, finished school, and got working in a radio factory. And they noticed that he could put the transistors faster together than anyone else. So he turned out to be a bit of a prodigy and eventually made his way to college. And this is a photograph of the young man. Eventually he was the scholarship PhD student in Cambridge. And there's this young fella horsing around with his friends in the laboratory. And this man, Yan Zhu, eventually met with Ian Fraser, and the two of them together put together the vaccine. And this was in FDA in Times Square in New York when it received FDA approval in 2005, and the first dose was given the next year in Australia. What's the ultimate irony is that Yan Zhu, after this was approved, he went back to China and died of complications secondary to hepatitis. So if he had been part of a proper vaccination program himself, he wouldn't have died of that disease, age 42. But here was the vaccine. So does it work? Well, does it work? It works incredibly well. And let's look at evidence from around the world. This is an article in June 2016 looking at a systematic review of 10 years of real-world experience from girls vaccinated before HPV exposure in countries with a high vaccine uptake. And following maximal reductions in HPV, the following maximal reductions in HPV infections and diseases have been reported. 90% for the HPV 6, 11, 16, 18. 90% drops in genital warts. 45% for low-grade cervical abnormalities. So this is our CIN. When I was telling you about this dysplastic scale, we're preventing that progression. 85% for high-grade histologically proven cervical abnormalities. And then you can see in Australia now, a decade on, vaccine has halved cervical cancer rate. But what about side effects? Now, when we talk about side effects, we have to think about the difference between correlation and causation. For example, the rise in autism in the last decade or 2 decades, this was produced in the United States, correlates with the rise in organic food sales. So does organic food cause autism? No. What about cell phones? The rise in cell phones can be correlated with the rise in autism. Do cell phones cause autism? No. Jenny McCarthy, one of the celebrities in the United States, has been talking about the association with autism and vaccines. We can correlate Jenny McCarthy's celebrity rise to the rise in autism. Okay, the point is this, and I'm not trying to be smart, but the point is that we can correlate anything. Okay, that doesn't make causation, and any of you who are trying to publish in good journals will be well aware of that. There's a difference between your editor will very sharply, and peer-reviewed journals will tell you very quickly your evidence is good, but it ain't good enough. So Professor Fergal Moon and myself last year wrote an article, just a letter into the Irish Times, because we're getting increasingly frustrated about some of the scaremongering that exists about this vaccine. And it comes down to 4 areas that people talk about: chronic fatigue syndrome, complex regional pain syndrome, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and autoimmune diseases. For serious adverse reporting, there's been no unusual pattern or clustering. What would you expect from 10 years in Australia? You would expect that there's clearly going to be a rise in these conditions. And one thing that's very important, we're not saying that these children don't exist. They do. We're not saying they don't need support. They do. We're not saying their parents don't need support. They do as well. But what we're seeing is the numbers of patients presenting with these diseases before vaccination and after vaccination are the same. If we saw a spike, what would we do? We wouldn't give it, of course. And that happens all the time with drugs. Drugs are pulled because we see clustering. But when you hear people talking about a constellation of symptoms and signs, it draws you further and further away from an actual one source. So let's look at the true side effects. Well, there are side effects. I'm not saying that the vaccine's perfect. Of course not. And essentially what the signs you're seeing here is the Greek rubor, or tumor calor. These are acute inflammatory responses. You give someone an injection of something else, it's going to hurt, and it does hurt. Redness, swelling, pain. The patient may faint. And interestingly, in the pre-licensure studies, anyone who got the injection was lying down. So that wasn't noted. So these are things that we do see. More extreme side effects such as anaphylaxis. For every 1 million doses, approximately 3 allergic reactions. And that's consistent with other vaccines as well. Now, in terms of adverse events, there's one thing we have to be clear about. A side effect and an adverse event is different. A side effect has a causal relationship to the medication. An adverse event is an event that occurs during or after use of the medicinal product, but its causal relationship has not been established. So in Ireland, let's look at what adverse events have been reported. And this will be anywhere from your GP to a pharmacist can report this. So there has been 1,082 reports of suspected adverse event. The majority of these are consistent with the types of effects known to occur with the vaccine. However, on this, there were 18 reports of chronic fatigue, 10 reports of post-viral fatigue, and 5 reports of autoimmune. So let's not ignore this. Let's go searching now. Let's go searching around all of the countries around the world, and can we show that this is related to this vaccine? So let's look at some of the largest studies of the world. This is looking, Denmark and Sweden, looking at autoimmune, neurological, venous thromboembolic, in other words, clot, adverse events after immunization. And they looked at vaccinated and unvaccinated populations, trying to see, is there a difference between the two? And you can see the extent of this study. And at the end of that, they found no evidence supporting associations between exposure to the quadrivalent, in other words, the 4-type, 611, 1618, and autoimmune, neurological, and venous thromboembolic adverse events in almost 1 million adolescent girls. They're not saying they don't exist. They're saying there's no spike. The difference between the unvaccinated groups and then the vaccinated groups, there is no difference. Let's look at another study from 2006 to 2015. This is a multicultural, multi-country, multi-center study. And again, serious adverse events such as pregnancy outcomes, autoimmune diseases, Guillain-Barré, causing paralysis, multiple sclerosis, anaphylaxis, clots, stroke were extensively studied, and no increase in the events was found compared to background rates. What about complex regional pain syndrome, which is another syndrome that's reported in relation to the vaccine? This is a vigorous international review of all potential complex regional pain cases. There was no sufficient data to suggest an increase in this secondary to vaccination. What about long-term side effects? Well, look here, this graph is showing you long-term side effects, and you have here vaccinated and unvaccinated over a time period. There's no known long-term side effects. And all international bodies have continually reported that HPV vaccine is safe with no long-term side effects. No increased rates in the serious long-term conditions, including autoimmune, chronic fatigue, in vaccinated girls. Now, we look in particular for the chronic fatigue. So this is a paper from Norway, which is recently out. Again, no indication of increased risk in chronic fatigue syndrome or ME following HPV vaccination observed among girls. These are independent studies. People say, oh, this is big pharma. It's not big pharma. I hear this all the time, as if big pharma, really have to, big pharma does post-licensure studies. I can do anything I want that's independent to pharma. And the thing is, do the results correlate with pre-licensure studies? Yes, they do. As a result, the European Medicines Agency in 2016 have confirmed that the vaccine does not support that they cause regional pain syndromes or another thing, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Now, you'll hear people saying, well, it doesn't last that long. And this is a study looking at 9.4 years. So the longest follow-up of clinical trial evaluating the efficacy, the immunogenicity, and safety of HPV vaccine to date. All vaccinees remain seropositive to HPV 16 and 18, with antibody titers remaining several folds above natural infection levels as measured by, and there were no safety concerns. So not only does it work, but it continues to work, okay? It continues to work. And let's look in Australia. Look now, after 10 years in Australia, what has happened? I heard the Minister of Health in Australia saying the other day, the jury's not out, the jury's in. And we're moving forward with this, and we're going to vaccinate and protect our children going forward. And look at the results that they're showing here. 70% reduction in HPV types responsible for almost 75% of cervical cancers. 50% reduction in the incidence of high-grade cervical abnormalities in Victorian girls under 18 years of age, and a 90% reduction in genital warts in heterosexual men and women under 21. And there's the reference if you want to go look that up. So what about boys? So gender-neutral vaccination is, in all these countries in the red at the side, is where gender-neutral is taking place. A very interesting statistic from Lancet. By 2020, ladies and gentlemen, oropharyngeal cancer will outpace cervical cancer. 4 times more men than women get oropharyngeal cancer. So we're going to hear more and more about this disease and this problem. So in terms of equity, there is a substantial burden of HPV disease in men. Screening is another issue as well. It's screening for the cervix is relatively flat. It's relatively easy to perform a screening procedure. The oropharynx screening is not easy because it's in these cryptid areas of reticulated epithelium is where these cancers develop in the oropharynx, in the lingual and palatine tonsillar tissue. So screening of these areas is very difficult. So we don't have in these areas, for example, that CIN 1, 2, and 3. The homosexual community, are we just going to ignore the homosexual community? Have we not ignored them for long enough? When we know that the vast majority of anal cancers are caused by HPV? Why are we vaccinating men? Why don't we vaccinate boys where you get a better response, a more durable response, prior to the onset of HPV infection? By vaccinating boys, we actually protect girls more, in particular girls who aren't vaccinated. And finally, when you talk about herd immunity is where indirectly you protect a proportion of your population that aren't vaccinated. That's fine, as that herd immunity is really important, and in particular in Ireland, where levels are dropping down to about 50% or so, we need boys and girls vaccinated. But remember, herd protection is only relevant if you stay in the herd. If you go outside of the herd and you're not vaccinated, you will be exposed. Now in the UK, some of you will have seen, they decided against this. This is a really bad decision. They decided against it, and there's been a lot of anger across the UK because of this. The model that was used for their HTA was very conservative, and the parameters were not published. When we look at cost effectiveness, one of the issues we look at is incremental cost effectiveness ratios. And the problem here is that if you just include cervical cancer, your ratios won't prove that it's economically beneficial. But when you add in the non-cervical diseases, it is. For example, in the UK, to add in boys in the vaccination program, it's an estimated 22 million sterling. To treat genital warts alone in the UK is 58 million sterling. Do the maths yourself. Now in HICWA now, Dr. Ryan is now in charge of the Irish HTA. This is a fantastic opportunity and fantastic that such an eminent doctor is involved in this process. And I would urge support to accelerate the HTA process, to start universal or gender-neutral vaccination in September 2018. So really that we put accelerate this process, because the jury is in, and ensure that an additional 30,000 boys are not left unprotected unnecessarily. Furthermore, if we're going to do this, let's do it right. We have a new 9-valent vaccine. Okay, and as I showed you, the 9-valent vaccine then can offer a wider area of protection. And this was a study looking at 15,776 9-valents versus 7,000 of the quadrivalents, and has a same side effect profile, except it offers a greater protection and supports widespread vaccination programs. And it's in many countries, as I've shown you here already. So let's practice evidence-based medicine. Let's practice contemporary medicine and offer this to boys and girls. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, vaccines aren't perfect. I'm not telling you that they are. But overall vaccines have far fewer side effects than most medical interventions. And the HPV vaccine is the most heavily scrutinized vaccine of all time and one of the safest. Key policy, medical, and regulatory organizations around the world have independently reviewed HPV vaccine data and continue to come up with the same answer. This lady, Junifer Russo, was an active member of the anti-vaccination group. And she writes a blog, Back from Nature. Her child has autism, and she said that there was no question in her mind vaccines were a conspiracy. All that I could think about all that I could think about was that I was doing what I needed to do to protect my children from this beast of modern medicine. But you know what she did? She decided that being a conspiracy theorist, life is really easy, because you decide not to take on these data, not to try and tackle it, to convince yourself for or against. She went and read the papers, got herself educated, and made a complete U-turn. And what she said was that I didn't think about the possibility that I was putting anyone else in danger, but now that I know that I was. So ladies and gentlemen, we need to practice evidence-based medicine. We need to value evidence and not anecdotes. We do have a HPV pandemic. That's not being sensational, that's the reality. HPV vaccines are safe, they are effective, We should have a gender-neutral vaccination program, and we should also have the 9-valent vaccine. Thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Thanks very much, Professor O'Neill. As I said, we'll hold off on some questions for a few moments while we have our second speaker up. So I guess we've spoken a lot already about the medicine and about the science. We have the opportunity to prevent this, but we also have the unfortunate reality that many in our community are diagnosed with head and neck cancers. So we felt it was very appropriate then to invite somebody to speak about the personal side of that, what that means to them against all of this backdrop of science and medicine, because it's very easy sometimes to look at pictures and look at them in abstraction and forget that there's a person behind there, there's a loved one, there's a father, there's a mother, there's a person who we cherish. And what impact does that have? So it's a very great pleasure to invite our next speaker up, Emily Hurricane. Emily is an author, will be very well known to many of you for her regular columns as a journalist as well. And she's spoken very openly about the impact of oral cancer in her life. She's lived and is living through that diagnosis and the treatment. And her columns in the Sunday Independent and in other areas have really given a tremendous insight. And I've spoken to other patients who've been very moved at that description, at the opening up of a conversation around something that isn't often spoken about. Emily is also, we're very grateful that she come along this evening because she's an author of note as well, and she has a book coming out, White Villa. I'm sure she won't mind me giving a plug for that, August 3rd, I think. So, you know, it's a very, very busy time in her life, but she's taken time out this evening to come along, and we're very grateful to that. Emily, I'd like you to come up and give us your experience, please.
Oops. Hi, good evening. Thank you for being here, and Professor O'Neill's a really hard act to follow, but I will, exactly as Robert said, try and do something different, obviously, which is not to talk to you about science, but to talk more about the reality of being somebody who gets diagnosed with cancer, mouth cancer, and HPV-related mouth cancer. And somebody I know, a really lovely girl who I'm very fond of, asked me recently, in all seriousness, she said, you know, given everything that you've been through and everything you've learned from that, and, you know, all the great positives that you've taken from it, if you had the opportunity to go back and change that and be a person who never had cancer, would you do it? And I said in a heartbeat I would, and she was really surprised. She was like, really, why? But, you know, you've been on such a journey, and, you know, it's all been so interesting, and, you know, you've taken all of these great things from it. I would change it in a heartbeat. If I could go back 2.5 years and go to my consultant, the wonderful Angus Curran, who diagnosed me, and, you know, go through all of that and tell him about my referred, or my ear pain, and, you know, the things that I didn't understand, and the funny lump at the back of my throat. If I could do all of that and go back and have him put a scope down and then put me under a general anaesthetic and wake me up and go, you're grand, off you go, I would do it in 1 second, because even though it was immensely interesting, and being by nature total Pollyanna who will always look on the bright side of anything that has a bright side, I did certainly learn an awful lot from it. But it was a really traumatic experience. It was horrible. It was physically very difficult because it's very painful and really nasty. And, you know, it has a huge effect on the people around you. And so, to go back a little bit, I'm 45 now, so I was 43 when I was diagnosed, and I was the healthiest person alive, except that I had cancer, but I didn't know that. And I have always been incredibly healthy. I don't drink, or, you know, no more than is very polite, the odd glass of wine. I gave up smoking well over 20 years ago, and I, long before anybody was Instagramming their hashtag eat clean, I was doing all of that stuff, brought up by a dogmatically macrobiotic mother. And, you know, loads of exercise, running 15, 20K a week, eating, all sorts of superfoods and, quinoa and all of those things. And I have always been incredibly healthy. I never got colds. I never got anything wrong with me. And so I certainly did not think that the weird lump that I felt at the back of my throat was cancer. I Googled it, and among a variety of possibilities, cancer was mentioned, but it never occurred to me that I was in any kind of high-risk category, because weirdly HPV did not come up very much, and I hope that that is different now, because I suspect that if I had seen that on a Google search, I might have been more inclined to think that it was a possibility for me, whereas I didn't. I looked what were the risk factors for mouth cancer, and I did not have them. I wasn't male, I wasn't, kind of 55 plus, didn't smoke, didn't really drink, and so I discounted it. And my doctor also pretty much discounted it. I went to my GP, who was wonderful, and referred me for many tests, most of which were the wrong ones. And we went round the houses together, the two of us, for about 6 months. And in that time, nobody talked about HPV. They talked about psychosomatic lump, that it wasn't actually there. I just thought it was there. And being a total idiot, I believed that for a while. And I was like, all right, I just think I have a lump. And then I went, well, actually, I just do have a lump. And so the point being that HPV just didn't really factor. So then I got the diagnosis, which will live on in memory as the worst day of my life, practically. There aren't many contenders, luckily, but it was horrible. It's an awful thing to be told. It's an awful thing to tell. And I've heard lots of people who have been diagnosed with cancer saying this, that you feel like you have let everybody down when you tell them that you have cancer. I hated telling my husband, my mother. I really hated telling my children. I have 3 of them, and the youngest was 5, and the oldest was 11 at the time. So he was old enough to know that cancer meant something really terrible. He had a friend in school whose mother had died of cancer. So that is a very difficult conversation to have. It's awful. And then when I found out that it was HPV, that's not a great thing you don't really love going around telling people that basically you have a sexually transmitted style virus that has given you cancer. And you feel, you feel awful, you feel embarrassed, and most of all, you feel terrified and incredibly lonely, because even though I was surrounded by an amazing team of healthcare professionals, and by that I mean every person that I came in contact with, in every ward, in every room, in every scanning unit, and every bit of it. They were amazing, they were supportive, they were brilliant, they were kind, and they were very caring, and they all went very far above and beyond what seemed to be a job. It was very much a vocation that they did. But even so, you are on your own. I mean, it is you who goes in there and who gets the mask, which was the first part of my treatment. And I don't know if any of you have seen a head and neck cancer mask. It's about the nastiest looking thing. It looks like a medieval torture instrument. It covers you to about here, and it's made of very hard mesh. It goes on soft and then it hardens. And it's fitted minutely to your form, and it's then put on you. And thank God I'm not claustrophobic. Loads of people are, and it's a horror beyond all horrors for them. But once you are put in the mask, you're then bolted onto a table so that you cannot move even a millimeter, and in a most uncomfortable position. And you spend every day for 7 weeks was the treatment that I got. So 5 times a week for 7 weeks, in the mask, on the table, in the radiotherapy unit. And I used to wonder what would happen if everyone in the hospital just mysteriously died and I was left lying on the table, unable to get off, because it's really, really nasty. And you are there and everybody leaves the room because they can't be in the radiotherapy room, because radiotherapy rays are, they cause burning and they cause all sorts of other things. Everybody scarpers and they shut the door behind you, and it's a really big, thick door, and you're in there on your own, and this awful machine kind of whirls and buzzes around you like some kind of an insane mosquito, feeding different radiotherapy waves, I'm going to say, at you. And that took about 20 minutes, I'd say, for me every day. And then in the meantime, there's a drug component as well that you get once a week, and it's usually chemotherapy. But because I did a clinical trial, I got a different drug, which gave me horrific spots, but it did not make me as sick, I think, as the chemotherapy would have done. So that was a good thing. And as it goes on, you do all right for the first couple of weeks. And then there seems to be a kind of an exponential decrease every day. So there's a doubling of the side effects. And the side effects are so nasty that when my consultant started to take me through the list of the possible things that would happen in terms of pain and swelling and burning and loss of taste and, you know, all the other things inside my mouth and around the, you know, the kind of the head and neck area, I begged him to stop because I just couldn't take it. I was like, I just don't need to know. I'll just go through it. It'll be fine. Just don't tell me, because if I don't have it in my head, I'll be much happier. And he was like, no, I have to tell you. And so he took me through everything. And mercifully, I've drawn a blank over most of that. I actually don't remember it because it was so horrible. And, you know, but the bits I do remember, he was right. Most of the things that he said would happen to me did happen. And so I suppose that by the beginning of week 4, you know, I was in pretty bad shape, still with another 3 weeks to go. You can't eat. There's no possibility of eating after the first few weeks. You're in so much pain that you can't swallow. You're also very sick, and I'm not exactly sure why, but there's a lot of vomiting that goes on. And there is no taste whatsoever, and your mouth is so raw that if somebody, I was given, people kept coming to see me, and they were so kind, and they would bring smoothies, and they would have made these smoothies themselves, and they would have made them with banana and avocado, and they would be all blended up together, and they would look like, you know, silk, something that would just slip smoothly and easily down any throat. And to be nice, even though I didn't want them, I would go, okay, I'll have a sip. And it was genuinely, and I'm not exaggerating, I promise, it was like picking up a handful of grit from the road and putting it into your mouth and trying to chew your way through it and swallow it down. Because the damage done was so heavy that really even a banana and avocado smoothie was like not even sand, it was grittier than sand, and no taste whatsoever. I mean, absolutely no taste at all. So eating, just, you cannot eat after a while, and then you're in an awful cycle of you can't eat, you lose a lot of weight, and then you're in a, you know, mentally terribly bad place, very demoralized, and, you know, very dizzy. At that point, I had a tube fitted up my nose down into my stomach to feed me. And even though I felt like one of the suffragettes, having the tube stuck up, that's what they used to do to force feed them in prisons. And it's very nasty. But I mean, you know, that was, like, I could cope with the nastiness because the benefit of actually getting some food, some calories into me that bypassed the whole problematic mouth area was amazing. By the time I finished, I had third-degree burns all over my neck, and I had to wear a big collar. I looked like a dog with fleas because I had this massive pink thing that was like a disinfectant strip to keep the burn out of the air. And, you know, still every day, no matter what you have, you still have to go to the radiotherapy unit and get in there and get that mask on, which hurts like hell when your skin has been burned off, and have it bolted to the table, and you've got to have more. So even though you are in rag order and you are descending, as they say at this stage, it's pretty much, you know, doubling of the effects every day. You have to keep going. You cannot, there's no sick note, there's no day off, you can't fake a meeting. You have to keep going in there and keep getting it done. And by the time I got to the end, I was like a kind of a really spotty walking skeleton, and out of my mind on morphine, and really excited to be finished, but exhausted. And I felt that I had pretty much, at that stage, checked out of my kids' lives many weeks previously. I would just come home from hospital and I was like a stray cat. I would slink up the stairs to bed and I would hope that they wouldn't see me because I didn't have the energy to talk to them, and I didn't want them to start telling me things because I couldn't. Anyone with kids will know they're always telling you stuff. I didn't have the energy to respond to anything that they said to me. I just needed to get into bed and pass out again. And, you know, that's awful. Part of me will always wonder what kind of an effect that had on them. It's fruitless speculation because nobody will ever know, and they're great now, and I am great. But, you know, it was awful. It was very tough on all of my siblings, awful on my husband. You know, I mean, the practicalities of it, I couldn't work, really, obviously. I wrote a column every week for the Sunday Indo, which still astonishes me, but in a way that was therapy. I mean, that meant, I'd say, more to me than it meant to anyone who read it. It was my one way of trying to make sense of the things that were happening to me. But other than that, I wasn't working, and my husband had to stop working as well because somebody had to take care of me, drive me in and out of hospital, you know, mind the kids, and all the rest of those things. So it was a really, really, really awful and tough time. And the aftermath, you know, much as being finished was a joy, and getting better was amazing. And the feeling I have of being lucky is really strong, because I think I am really lucky. I think that I'm so lucky that I caught it in time, that I saw the right people who did all the right things, and did, you know, evidence-based medicine, as you say. They did what they needed to do, and I don't have cancer anymore, and the side effects have diminished, and most of them are long gone. I have, you know, some small things that I may have for a while more, or they may continue, I don't know. I had rampant hypochondria for quite a long time, which was tough, because even though I laughed at hypochondria before, I was like, oh, people think they're sick all the time. In actual fact, when I realized that it's constant gnawing anxiety about your health, it's not that pleasant, and it's not that funny. You know, and lots of little things, many, you know, most of which now have gone. I feel amazing. I have published my second novel, as Robert was so kind to say, and it seems to me that I got very lucky, and I will always be grateful for the incredible care and the help that I got. But I also feel that I would have been a lot luckier if I had never got this in the first place. And I had thought that I had done all the right things, you know, the healthy stuff, the eating right, the not smoking, the running, and I didn't know anything about the HPV aspect of it, and, you know, at the age I am, wouldn't have made much difference if I had known. But the idea that there is something that means that other people don't have to go through the thing that I did, and that their families don't have to go through it with them, I cannot understand why we're not all beating the doors down and demanding that our kids, boys and girls, get vaccinated against it. So, thank you all very much.
I'm going to be drawing things to a conclusion, but before I do, I'd just like to thank Emily. When we talk about cancer and cancers, we often get a very abstract context. I don't think anybody can but be touched by that, but it's very difficult to open and be so honest about such an important aspect of your life, such a damaging, so many different emotions. So thank you very much, Emily, because I know that can't have been easy. As the National Cancer Charity, we know that anytime we talk about cancer, we know that people are impacted. So if there are people online that are impacted and want to talk to somebody, I'd just like to give a plug. It's on the screen there, but we have a free phone nurse line with a qualified oncology nurse there during the hours indicated, Monday to Friday. And you can talk to those free about any aspect and in absolute confidence. Obviously, our 13 daffodil centres dotted around the country in each of the major oncology treating hospitals as well, and we have a very active and vibrant online community. I'll close by thanking everybody for their attention. As I mentioned at the very outset, this is part of an ongoing series of communication that we do around cancer research matters, highlighting the latest topics, giving the facts, and giving incredible speakers. If you're interested in following this further, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Simply email us on researchevents@irishcancer.ie. You can join on the website as well. So at this stage, I'll draw things to a conclusion. Thank you very much. We're going to have a few questions now, where we're going to finish our streaming, and thanks to those that have joined us. So I'd like to invite our panel to come up, if they wouldn't mind, up to the seat. So Professor O'Neill and Emily Hurricane are going to be joined by a few other speakers to be able to address any questions that may happen now from our audience, from what we've seen. So we've Dr. Brenda Corcoran, who's a consultant in public health medicine from the National Immunisation Office, and she's also a member of the National Immunisation Advisory Committee. Professor Fergal Malone, who's Professor and Chairman of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the RCSI School of Medicine. He's a consultant obstetrician as well as a subspecialist consultant in maternal fetal medicine based at Rotunda Hospital. And last but not least, Professor Alf Nicholson, who's RCSI Professor of Paediatrics based in Temple Street University Hospital. So I'd like to invite each of you up, and our panel have very kindly agreed to field any question or any query that may arise. And we've some, apart from reasons we're not streaming, if the sound doesn't tend to work in this type of environment. So we have a few microphones, so we're going to hang on to one. Here, or we'll just get these out. We'll leave one here. Okay. I'll pass to the might ask you to come out home if we can pass along. So we've had an incredible evening going all the way across the basic biology, what's going on with medicine, science, right into the personal impact. Is there anybody who would like to ask any question or any? I have one or two myself, but I kind of thought I might ask, but I didn't want to hog the limelight. Obviously answered every question. I guess one of the things that we can't shy away from, and Paul spoke about it so eloquently, we have a vaccine. It's got a lot of proven efficacy. We know its safety profile. It's been out in the wild, as it were, out in nature with over 80 million people being vaccinated. But yet in Ireland, we've gone from very high uptake, very therapeutic uptake, nearly 87%, nearly 90%, nearly 9 in 10 eligible girls taking up the vaccine. We've gone to 50%. There's some signs that that's stabilised now. Why have we gotten into this situation? I might maybe ask some of our new panel, as it were, to give us a chance to rest their voice. Maybe Alf, you might.
Thank you very much. Well, I think there are families who we've met that have young girls who have chronic fatigue or other symptoms similar to chronic fatigue syndrome, a very, very distressing condition. And they've formed a group, and that group believed passionately, I think incorrectly, that the vaccine was directly responsible for their symptoms. And that's gathered a lot of steam and a lot of momentum over the last few months. Now, we've tried, and lots of people have tried to actually ensure that the public and even that group themselves are aware that this isn't the case. But it's quite difficult to change their view of it because they're going through a very difficult time, and their children, their girls, going through a very difficult time. It's a very serious and chronic condition. We certainly offered that we would like to set up a pathway and a clinical care pathway that really meets their needs. I think, as was said, this is a very difficult condition to manage. We haven't seen any increase in prevalence, but again, we don't know the exact prevalence of this condition nationally. All we know is by international standards, there's been no surge. Now, of course, in the recent past, there was the swine flu vaccine, which did cause a problem, and that was identified, has been rectified, and the families have been offered very definite care and attention. And there have been, in the past, as you rightly said, scares about the whooping cough vaccine when I was a little boy, the more recent MMR scare, and all proven unfounded. So in essence, as a paediatrician, I would be advising, certainly our own girls that have been vaccinated, that all girls of the age group that should be vaccinated should be vaccinated, because that is a safe vaccine. And I agree very strongly that boys should also be vaccinated.
So your clinical experience would predate vaccination, and you would have treated girls and boys with these conditions?
Girls and boys, yeah, that's one thing that will be very hard to explain with the vaccine, but there are quite a significant number of boys, not as many as girls, who have chronic fatigue symptoms currently under medical care and attention. But it's certainly, to my mind, there's no causal link, and I think that's been good
HPV-related cervical cancer can take 20 years from its initial viral effects on the epithelium before you actually get to invasive cancer. And I think because that's not an obvious immediate impact, you vaccinate for measles, you don't get measles. You vaccinate for a HPV-related cervical cancer, and you don't apparently see the benefit until years down the road when the cervical cancers are not happening. But if people have got it into their head that the vaccine might be causing chronic fatigue syndrome, they can see that, or at least they make that link immediately. So when you do, in their mind, the risk-benefit analysis, they see this apparently immediate or short-term risk, but the benefit they wouldn't be seeing until years down the road, and probably not seeing at a population level. And it's very hard for people who are not in public health medicine or not into the biology of these conditions to weigh that risk-benefit correctly and make the right decision. And I think that's one of the challenges that people have when they try to understand the biology of this. So, you know, even though the data is very strongly supportive of vaccination, and for girls 9 to 26, that's what we would like to get out there. You know, people who perceive themselves that they've been the victims of a side effect of the vaccine, it's really hard to shake.
Thanks very much. I think one of the challenges we have in HPV vaccine is that we give it in the schools. That's a very good thing because we know the uptake in school-based vaccinations is much better than when it's given in other cases. And we also know that the World Health Organization recommends school-based programs, and that's what we've been doing since we started the program. But one of the issues in giving a school-based program is that the vaccination teams, that is usually nurses and doctors together who work employed by the HSE, who visit the schools on a twice yearly basis, they don't see the parents. They don't eyeball the parents, and we know that one of the best ways of convincing parents to provide vaccinations is if a healthcare worker talks to them and offers them the vaccine, a trusted healthcare professional. So we don't have that in a school-based program. That's not to say we shouldn't do a school-based program, because as I said already, the uptakes have demonstrated have been much better in a school-based program. But what we have to do is to have advocates to act on our behalf, other healthcare professionals, which is why this forum today is so important, that other healthcare professionals and other interested members of the general public can help us in advocating for this vaccine. Because we know that many parents are getting their information incorrectly on social media. They're believing what they see in tweets, in Instagram and Facebook. They're not looking for evidence-based medicine. They listen to what other people in the schoolyard when they're collecting their children saying to them. And that's a huge challenge for us. But I have to say, certainly since this dramatic drop happened, and it is a huge drop from 87% to 50%, and that's a huge challenge and a great concern to everybody involved in cancer prevention. We've had nothing but positive support from our healthcare professional colleagues, and events such as tonight and other interested bodies are also coming on board to support the fight, because we know that this vaccine is safe, we know this vaccine is effective, and we all have a duty of care to improve the care of both boys and girls in this regard.
Catherine O'Neill, Lecturer in Public Health in Galway. Just on that point, there was thank you to both the speakers, there was a fabulous array of evidence, not just showing how effective it is, but also disproving a lot of the myths about the side effects. And I do think we have a knowledge translation problem here. It's very easy for healthcare professionals and academics to read the evidence and say this is wonderful, it's showing it's effective and it's showing that it doesn't have side effects. But we know that that's not where a lot of mothers or fathers or parents get their advice. They're turning to social media, they're turning to family, and the last place we're finding is any academic source or the HSE website. They're actively looking beyond that. So how can we be more inventive or nuanced in how we get the message across, rather than, we know that telling people it doesn't work, so how could we, I suppose that's a kind of
HSC perspective, we certainly have to get much more involved in the social media space. We perhaps have been much later coming to the table than the anti-vaccine groups, there's no doubt about that. And there's a huge amount of work that's gone on behind the scenes in relation to that. And I also think that some of the initiatives that we've done with the Irish Cancer Society and with the other organisations that are coming on board now, we're working, for example, with the Department of Education, with school management bodies, with the unions, the teachers' unions, with any body that will work with us, and I know the Irish Cancer Society are also working with other bodies. It's about disseminating the information in whatever way we can and getting advocates to help us. Because a one-on-one conversation is often a bit more powerful than what you read on a website or what an expert tells you. And we have to realise, even though some of us are health professionals, we are also friends, we are also relations, we also have nieces, nephews, daughters, granddaughters, and we can also translate that information in that forum, and we can do that as well. And there certainly is evidence from the information that we have that the uptake has stabilised, and in the second round when we did the vaccinations, about 1 to 5% of girls came forward who hadn't had the vaccine in the first round. It's not over by any manner of means, and it's a huge challenge. If you look at what happened in Denmark, their uptake was over 80%, it went down to 15%, and is still at that level, maybe up to 20%. So we can certainly not sit on our laurels, but we have to continue with this work because we know it's the right thing to do.
Could I ask maybe Emily to add in on that, because I think Brenda has given a very professional answer to that, but you're a mother and you're also, as a journalist, you're a social observer. That's one of the roles and functions of a journalist, is to get a sense of the pulse of society and to write and articulate some aspect of that that will be of interest to people. Do you have any particular view in terms of the journey? You've been watching it from a number of different angles. Have you any thoughts?
Well, and nobody will want to hear this. I think it's really difficult to counter a very emotional piece of information with a very unemotional piece of information, and it is. And I know I have friends. We all have friends who, when they hear about the vaccine, will go, "Oh God, don't let your daughters get that because I heard of somebody who blah blah blah," and they will come out with these stories that put the fear of God into any parent. You're not a normal parent if you hear that story, and if there is not a small part of you that goes, "Could that be true?" And then you have to, as a rational person who believes in rationality, you have to make a decision to inform yourself and to get the best possible information that you can and look beyond the emotive stories and make your decision. But of course, not everybody is going to do that. They're going to hear the emotive story and they're going to go, "Ugh." And I speak as somebody, like my oldest son was, I'd say he was 4 by the time I got him the MMR, because I was scared out of my wits at those stories. And it took me that long to do my research and feel comfortable with it and, get over the fear. And so I do understand that parents feel like this. It is only normal. You're not a good parent if you do not do what you feel is right to protect your son, daughter. And so it is, you're fighting very, very emotional, instantly translatable information. I know somebody who got it and this happened, with something that takes longer to communicate and is much more dull, frankly. And as a media person, the scare stories are the ones that grab people's attention and get headlines. But I think that you got to keep going, and you just have to keep presenting the information in the simplest form possible. And if you can distill it down into one absolutely key message, and make that the punchiest that you possibly can, and then you just have to keep saying it, and you have to keep saying it to everybody who will listen, and you have to keep saying it in all the forums. And I think that social media probably was a little bit maybe outside the scope of what the HSE did, and so there was a proliferation of anti-vaccination stories that really grabbed hold, and people don't distinguish. They see something on Facebook and they go, "Oh well, that's news," or "That's information," and they don't necessarily understand that it isn't. So I think you just have to keep saying it and saying it and saying it again. And I think the media have been pretty good about reporting the balanced side of the story, and I think that those reports do have some effect on people. And I think that if it is reiterated again and again and again, calmly and in a nutshell, people will start to get it. I hope.
Thanks Rob, thanks Pan, Bronnie O'Rourke, Irish Cancer Society, and I just want to reiterate what Emily has said, because part of the challenge is that we are caught up in the post-fact fake news narrative, and there's no escaping that, and there's no knowing how long it's going to be before that finishes. So the rule of thumb that we use in the Irish Cancer Society is that, generally speaking, you've got 10% of people who are bought into it already. You keep telling them the same thing to make sure they stay on board. You've got 10% who, no matter what you say to them, it's not going to make any difference. So you make a decision, are you going to focus your energies there? Because generally your energies are fairly limited in what resources you have. And then the final thing is you have the 80% who are genuinely concerned, as Emily says. It's very hard to ignore a sick girl in a wheelchair and pass it off as something. So there has to be compassion brought to the argument, but fundamentally we must stick with the facts. And the moderate voice, unfortunately, is being lost in this fake news dilemma we find ourselves in. So it's to try and give ourselves space for the moderate voice to come back into the scenario. And when you have somebody that Paul talked about earlier on, who was a rabid anti-vaxxer, taking the time to educate herself on the realities of it, that does give me hope, So I really think it's about focusing our energies where they are going to pay the most dividends. Thanks.
Gentleman over here has a question.
Just to thank all the speakers for tonight. My name is Eze. I'm a community pharmacist. I work in Limerick, so I expect a journey coming down to Dublin for this talk tonight. I'm just going to try to compare the HPV vaccine to the flu jab and the work community pharmacists have done in that regard, especially as has been earlier mentioned that the school program is really good and has shown a good success in terms of uptake of the vaccine. Would you be considering, like, when you're pushing or when lobbying for universal vaccination of both boys and girls for the HPV vaccine, would you be pushing for even the community pharmacy pilot study just to see if that can improve the uptake of the vaccine? Because from experience, we do know that community pharmacies are a working center for parents to come in and find out information about various health conditions. It could be not to brag, but we are highly respected in the community, and parents who trust our inputs as well. And they find us very approachable because they don't have to pay or ring for appointment. Would you consider this a good opportunity or something to even try out in the future while pushing for a universal vaccination?
Yeah, just to say that's a really interesting point, and I know the Department of Health are considering extending the vaccines that pharmacists can provide, the vaccines that they currently provide, as you mentioned, the flu vaccine. But in the interim, we have had regular contact, and only in the last 2 weeks would have met with the Irish Pharmacy Union and the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland, who are really behind this programme, this HPV vaccine, and have very much said that they totally support us. And what we're going to do now, between now and September, is have information sessions for pharmacists so that they can provide information, they can support it, and that it becomes known that if you talk to your pharmacist, you will get some basic information. They obviously can come to us for further information, but just to know there are other trusted health professionals out there that will give them the advice to advocate for the vaccine in the interim until such time as when the vaccine may be available in pharmacies. I don't have a timeline for that because that's within the Department of Health.
A question. Paul, I wonder if you might be able to address this one. I guess up until maybe 10 years ago, up until maybe 10 years ago, when somebody had a cancer diagnosis, whatever it was essentially something that might strike randomly, notwithstanding a few diseases where there could be an explanation. Are there challenges with discussing with a patient and their family around a disease that has a sexual association? And how, as a professional, do you get the person kind of through that, get their family and focus on their health rather than the stigma?
Well, I think you do ENT head and neck surgery to get as far away from the urogenital system as possible. So does it create a problem? Of course it does. Of course it does. But I think, look, with cancer, what you have to do is be honest. You just have to be brutally honest with people, and we are. And what do I say? If someone has a HPV positive tumour, what I do is I will firstly introduce them to P16 positive, which is a surrogate marker for HPV, and then I will tell them it's a HPV related tumour, and I will tell them that this is a good thing, and I'll tell them the data. Once we fully stage someone, the staging is basically where we use what's called the TNM system. So T is the size of the tumour, your N is the nodal status, M is metastatic status. What we see with oropharyngeal cancers is a small t, so the primary tumours with HPV are quite small, but over 85% of people would present with disease in their neck. Now, this is a different type of cancer. When you hear about, say, other cancers of the breast or colon, when you hear about the nodes being involved, clearly that has a very poor prognostic indication. With standard squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck, the chemical carcinogenic driven type, if you have disease in your neck, your survival drops by 50%. But that's not the case with the HPV disease. It's a totally different type of disease. So once we fully stage someone, then we sit down and tell them the absolute realities of what they have and what they will need. And that's following discussion at the multidisciplinary meeting. So yes, initially I have to say I did feel uncomfortable at this, but now people are more educated about this topic, so when you mention it to them, people generally know what you're talking about. And if they don't, I have no hesitation now in telling them that actually this is a good thing. As well as that, as long as you can communicate well with your patient, what patients need, in particular at a time of diagnosis, they need a pathway. Because there's so many things going around their head that you need to give that patient, this is what we're going to do now, this is what your treatment will be, and let them deal with the shock, but you're giving them a pathway. And as long as you're honest with your patient and tell them the reality of what's going on, then I think, yes, it's upsetting initially, but patients do accept it and they move forward.